Have you ever wondered, what's the best Middle-earth movie? Are you a Helm's Deep person?
Now the ruin and the red dawn.
Maybe you're all about Samwise the Brave.
But I can't carry you.
Or you could have bought all the Thor and Oakenshield stock back in 2013, and you're just holding until the world learns to really appreciate the king under the mountains.
Am I not the king?
Today, we go through it all. From hobbits to elves, Gollum to Boromir, this is the best and the worst of Middle-earth.
You shall not pass!
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of The Best and the Worst. And today we're talking the best and the worst of Middle-earth. I'm Andrew Ghai. Joining me, as always, is Ben Bateman.
What's going on, everybody? It's a huge episode. It's an epic episode. I was kind of bracing my body to communicate how big of an episode. I was going to explode, but then, here I am. I'm excited to talk about this. We've been talking about Lord of the Rings movies since, we met. Over 10 years, we've been nerding out about these movies.
Well, then even before we met, we grew up when The Lord of the Rings was coming out in theaters. I think everyone our age, this was like a monumental moment in their life. So we're going to talk about the best and the worst of Middle-earth. So, of course, all three Lord of the Rings movies, all three of the Hobbit movies. And what is this show? If you don't know what it is, well, the best and the worst is a show that we host, and we basically take any topic in the film world, the film sphere, whether it's a director, an actor, a theme. Like next week, we're going to be doing disaster movies, or like this, a franchise in Lord of the Rings in Middle-earth. We take it, we look at all the movies, we analyze it, we break down, we tell you guys what's the best and what's the worst by the end of the episode. That way, if you're at a conversation, you're talking about Lord of the Rings, you go, oh, I know what the best movie is there, and I can tell you exactly why, because of my boys Ben and Drew.
Yeah, you want to sell it to your friends. You're one of those cool Lord of the Rings parties. Nice call back to the old show.
So, last week we did the best and the worst of M. Night Shyamalan, an awesome episode. You guys can check that out, whether it's on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or on our YouTube channel. And there's a lot of ways to support this show.
Yeah, if you guys like what you hear here and you guys want to get involved, leave us a 5-star review on the podcast app. It is super, super helpful. A rating and a review on there just takes a second. If you can follow the show on Spotify as another way, or if you're watching this on YouTube or listening and you'd like to watch it on YouTube, it's youtube.com/actionindustries. Go subscribe and leave a comment. Any of those ways totally helps the show, and we've loved doing it. We're past 10 episodes now. We're in the second season of season 1, so to speak.
That's right. People are mad at Spotify right now.
Yeah,
they're not very happy with Spotify, but we are still on Spotify. But if you don't support them, go check us out on Apple Podcasts. So, why are we talking about Middle-earth today? Well, like you said, we love it. We've talked about it our entire friendship, and probably for most of our lives. But there was the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power was announced. That was a big, it was a trailer for the title of a show, which is I think just that alone kind of shows you how big this is, the magnitude of this, because how often do people care about seeing a trailer for the name of a show? There's really nothing else kind of divulged in that.
One thing that I thought was totally hilarious about this was there's such a major criticism that goes towards the second trilogy with the use of CGI. And there's a large sequence in one of the films in which molten stuff goes through and it's all CGI. And they shot that exact same effect practically for the title reveal. It's not CGI, which was made me laugh when that came up in the thing where I was like, they actually did practical for a title screen? That's what they did?
And I think what they're trying to do, and we're obviously going to talk about this a lot, because when you go back and you watch these 6 movies, in the first 3, the CG is very, very minimally distracting and also very minimally noticeable. Whereas you watch all 3 Hobbit films and it kind of is distracting. I think that's almost the best way to put it, is there's so much CG everywhere in those 3 movies that you really can't not notice it. And then, so with The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, I have a feeling that they were really trust us. Even this intro, this crazy molten title screen is going to be practical. We had to burn a whole city down. We had to set up a volcano, but we made it happen just so we didn't have to do it on the computer.
Yeah, it's definitely a really interesting conversation when you kind of go, we grew up with this original trilogy, and then there was another trilogy that came out, and it was a ways later. It was about a decade later, give or take. So it really spoke to another generation of people who had grown up with the original. But that original trilogy, obviously, most famously Return of the King winning Best Picture and winning 13 Oscars. It was a huge movie. We saw each of those films in a movie theater with our families. I mean, on Christmas, 3 years in a row, it was an event. It was a phenomenon. What do you think when you look back 20 years ago? How does that memory feel for you?
Man, even still now, in 2022, every time that I get together with my family, which is usually at Christmas time, it's the only time that everyone can get together. There's a lot of us. We always watch Lord of the Rings. We sometimes watch all three, sometimes just one, but we always watch at least one of them. Like, people always talk about their favorite Christmas movies. Like, Lord of the Rings is truly one of my favorite Christmas movies. They came out around Christmas time. I saw them with my family when they were coming out, which is why we continue to watch them even now, 20 years later. It was like one of the most exciting things, period. Like, you'd heard about the pre-production for years. You'd heard about how they shot all movies back to back to back. They just lived in New Zealand for years to do this.
Yeah.
Like, they built these incredible sets. It's like the whole world had their hand on the pulse of Lord of the Rings, and then like being able to watch them and them actually be that good, right? Like, I remember going and watching like Batman and Robin in the theaters with my sister and like being hyped and being like, oh, this is going to be so great.
And then you came out and you're like, that was great.
And I was like, oh yeah, that movie was actually pretty sweet. But in reality, it was not. Whereas like with Lord of the Rings, you were like waiting and waiting for the year. I mean, like Gandalf falls and you're like, what? I have to wait.
Oh my God.
And then it literally just picked back up, and every single time it was so well done. It was so satisfying. I was never let down, which is like, how many movies out there, let alone trilogies, franchises, can you say that about, that they never let you down?
Well, I also think they exist in this really kind of remarkable territory where all three movies are so strong. They're all so strong, and they came out in sequence with such hype, and they delivered on that hype. There's really almost no discussion that discredits one of these movies. Like, you think about the quality of Dune this year or last year, and Dune's a really good movie. I liked Dune a lot. I didn't think Dune was like amazing, but I liked it a lot. And if they make 2 more Dune movies and they're both really good, it's not even going to touch Lord of the Rings. Like, it doesn't, and they're trying for that same thing. Yeah. That's very much what Dune feels like.
It's a really interesting point that you make. And I think literally, if you want to take it like piece by piece, I think Fellowship is exponentially better than the Dune that we just got, even though I really liked it. That would mean that Dune 2 and Dune 3 have to be like at least 5 times better than Two Towers and Return of the King to also counterbalance the fact that Fellowship is better than the first Dune. It feels like an impossible task.
Totally. And I think that there's, we always talk about how era and generation determines a lot of the way that something's perception is formed. And so when we grew up, you could still have a blockbuster trilogy that wasn't, Iron Man and Captain America. You could still do that. It's really hard to do that now. We live in kind of a different time. And Lord of the Rings, the funny thing is, I grew up, my mom read me Lord of the Rings books. Yep. So I like knew the story, I knew the Hobbit, like I knew all the characters. And so I was ready for these movies when they came out. Like, I kind of was like, okay, I was raised on this. This is important. I don't know how many other people were. I mean, a lot of people, was very famous. But if the movies hadn't been successful, the Lord of the Rings, like the IP, that story would not be famous like it is. Nobody talks about the books in the way they talk about the movies.
Yeah, and I think in order to get the movies to the scale that Lord of the Ring was, the only thing that was ever even kind of close in terms of coming from an IP already feels like maybe Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Right? And I think a big part of that is like what you're saying. I grew up reading The Hobbit and reading Lord of the Rings, so by the time these movies came out, it was obviously like much closer, because it's like, I read Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit when I was in middle school, and like the movies came out right around then as well. But I'm trying to think about now, right? Because they tried with Artemis Fowl, didn't work. That was a really popular book series. They tried with Ender's Game, that was also a really popular one. So it's like, what book series that has been being read over maybe the last 10 years will be the next Lord of the Rings, the next Harry Potter? And I think I'm too old to know that.
They try constantly with these young adult adaptation series. Yeah, Hunger Games. They try with the Maze Runner. I mean, it's
Divergent.
Yeah, and it's not like these are, you can't compare Tolkien's writing to most of those books.
Fair.
Because most of those books are, they're not schlocky. I don't want to offend anybody, but the Lord of the Rings text and the Hobbit text is like regarded by people that read as like some of the great writing ever.
Yeah.
My older brother, for instance, famously, who hates everything,
he actually likes them.
He hates Lord of the Rings movies more than anything.
Because he loves the books?
Because he was so attached to the books growing up. He was so in love with the books. He just when he watched the movies, he was like, I hate everything about this. I can't compete with this. It ruins the thing I loved. And that's because those books are so iconic to the people that grew up reading
Did he feel any better about the extended versions, or no?
I don't know if he ever gave him a shot.
Well, what's so interesting is because like that's a big conversation about why Lord of the Rings was so good and why The Hobbit wasn't. You have so much subject material to pull from, that you have to actually cut stuff out that's in the books for Lord of the Rings, as opposed to what happened in The Hobbit. So, that was my relationship with growing up with Lord of the Rings. What about you? I mean, your brother hated it, but did the rest of your family love it? Did you watch it a ton? Like, what?
We loved it. I agree with you. It's funny you described it as a Christmas movie because, my family's Jewish, but we always had a Christmas tree, and we always would go see these movies on Christmas together.
Of course.
And so they do have that part of the year. And I mean, we're both the right age where these came out exactly at the right time. Yeah. I mean, these came out when we were like, pre-teen, like 13, 14, 15 years old. And I think I have such fond memories of them. The way that they were acknowledged by the Academy dignified these movies, I think, when the Oscars now, I recognize it's much more political than I did then. But at that age, when something wins Best Picture and it wins that many Oscars, you're like, well, this has to be an all-time level thing that's going on right now. And it's now being verified. It's being validated. So I loved these movies. I watched them 100 times. My favorite one has changed over the years.
Yeah.
And it's funny because, like, I knew the difference between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And so I recognized that when they made the trilogy, when they, Lord of the Rings became the trilogy, I was like, well, that makes sense. I wish we could see Bilbo. I mean, I wish we could see the Lonely Mountain. Like, this is stuff that I remember.
Yeah.
But I was like, but that's not this story, and that's okay. And I never felt like I needed it. Like, it wasn't something that, like, it didn't ruin Lord of the Rings for me.
Well, right, because it's funny. Going into watching Lord of the Rings, I was a bigger fan of Bilbo than Frodo.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's kind of the way that you're taught growing up, reading The Hobbit and then going into the books. So, yeah, that's why we're talking, Middle-earth today, because Rings of Power is out. We both grew up with Lord of the Rings. Just a little bit more information on the Rings of Power for you guys. It's coming out in the fall, I think early September this year. It's a prequel, so it's going to be more about the 19 rings and the 20th ring, the Ring of Power. But it's going to be 5 seasons about those other 19 rings and the things that kind of came before what we saw in Lord of the Rings.
Amazon Prime series, right?
Yeah, and so they bought the rights for $250 million from Tolkien, which was pretty substantial, but then the budget is $1 billion for the series. Now, when they said that originally, I didn't know it was for 5 seasons. I thought it was just for 1.
Yeah.
And I was like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Like, how is this even possible? But it is the budget for 5 seasons. So, we're not going to talk too much about the Rings of Power. I think that it would be so much speculative talk and like what we wish is going to happen, but that's why we're here today talking about Middle-earth. So going back to this franchise, going back to this show, The Best and the Worst, one thing that we always like to do is kind of take that inspiration thought movie, whether it's a release or an anniversary or something like this, a TV show being announced, and we try to like take the idea of Middle-earth or of M. Night Shyamalan or of Scream and come up with a big, bold statement about it, a thesis statement, if you will, as if this was a scientific paper, which it is. This show is very scientific.
Incredibly scientific. And it's funny, I was going to ask you this question, and it actually leads nicely into our thesis. And my question to you was going to be, 20 years later, how do you think the Lord of the Rings trilogy has aged?
Yeah, I think that is a perfect segue, because I truly believe, and as the thesis statement of the show, that the Lord of the Rings is the best trilogy of all time.
Greatest movie trilogy ever.
Greatest movie trilogy ever. And
better than the John Wick trilogy.
Better than the John Wick trilogy. Better than the Cornetto 3.
The Taken trilogy.
Better than the Taken trilogy. Better than the Dark Knight. Better than Star Wars. Better than Godfather. Those are really the other ones that are actually in that conversation.
You just slip one in there in the middle. Yeah, I think the big question mark that people are going to have, and I know our producer PLD is probably on the other side of this outline that we're looking at here, and he's probably scoffing. And many people will, I think. But we had a real conversation about, could we go with this thesis, and we decided to go with it because I think wholeheartedly I agree with you.
Yeah.
I think it's close because I do think Star Wars is an incredible trilogy, but I also think that there's just no denying there are elements to my favorite Star Wars movie, which is Return of the Jedi, that are silly and campy and slow. There are elements in the first one that I think are a little slow now. I do love them all, but when I watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy, it hooks me from beginning to end every time. I love everything about it. It feels like such an experience that it's not propped up by legend and action figures. It's propped up by my experience and memory of the story and loving the casting. It's perfect.
And what they did, like, there's a reason why it's aged so well. All the practical that they've done, the 3 years of pre-production, shooting all the movies in sequence, like all of that, and the amount of time and energy that Peter Jackson put into making sure that this was going to be exactly what he wanted. The storyboarding from beginning to end, from first to third, all the way through is like, you look at it now and all that work paid off, right? It all holds up. The minimal CG that they use, the incredible practical, the set designs, like Hobbiton is like you could go to the Shire now in New Zealand, right? It's like a real place in the world because they built it, you know? And so like, I think why it's the greatest of all time is when you look at how it's aged, it's tough because really the only other real conversations are Star Wars, The Godfather, and Dark Knight.
Yeah.
And I think Dark Knight is a pretty easy one for you and I because like we like Dark Knight Rises, but we know it's not a great movie and we don't like Harvey Dent. No. We don't like that. In the second one, Godfather 3 is really, really bad.
Yeah.
It really is just Star Wars in my opinion.
There are like redeeming elements to the weaker movies in those trilogies, but they don't pack the full punch that and again, we're talking about great trilogies here. So it's not to discredit any of these things we're talking about. They're all great.
They're all incredible.
I actually love Godfather 3. I just think it's a bad movie.
Yeah.
And I love Dark Knight Rises, even though I recognize that it's kind of bloated.
I love that movie.
But I do think it really does come down to Lord of the Rings versus Star Wars. And this is a matter of preference. I think for you and I, it's taken a lot of years to reconcile that this is kind of, I really do feel this way. But if you tell me right now, sit down and watch one of these trilogies and which one's going to make you feel more like jacked up at the end of it, it's definitely Lord of the Rings. And it's not even really close.
And I think also it's generational, right? Like PLD being maybe the generation before ours, he was a person that was able to watch the Star Wars movies in theaters. Yeah. Like, what is that like? I don't know. I can't imagine what it was like waiting for Empire and then waiting for Jedi to come out. The same way that we had to do for Lord of the Rings. I really think that because of how old we are and where we grew up, that's why it's the greatest trilogy of all time for us. I think Star Wars it's literally a coin toss for most people out there. So this is the best and the worst. We got to get into talking about the best and the worst here of Middle-earth. But first, this is where you guys can get involved with the show. If you guys check out patreon.com/teamaction at the captain level or above, we are starting to do this on the show where you guys can basically call into the show. You guys leave us a voice memo or you can write us an email of your thoughts of whatever topic is at hand. We will read it on the show or we will play it on the show and then we'll have a conversation about it. You guys might even be able to change our opinions, might even be able to change our rankings. So get those in now. Check out patreon.com/teamaction. Next week's episode, in honor of Moonfall, is going to be the best and the worst disaster films. It's going to be a lot of fun. We were going to maybe do Roland Emmerich, but I don't think either of us wanted to do that to ourselves. So we're going to go with the best and worst disaster films, but that's how you guys can get involved with the show.
Yeah, there's going to be some awesome movies to talk about next week. Anybody who has been watching the internets and the trailers recently has seen that Moonfall is a hotly contested film. We're very excited. The moon is the enemy. They cast some top-notch actors for this one.
That damn moon.
And we're screening it this week, so we're very excited for that, and we'll be talking about, I mean, we have to really go through because there's a tremendous number of options. You've got the Emmerich films, you got Dante's Peak and Volcano, you got Armageddon in there, Independence Day, Twister.
You got things like Perfect Storm, like does that count?
You can go older, like the Towering Inferno, or you can go with the original, like Airport. I mean, there's like a lot of crazy stuff that gets thrown into this conversation. Oh, Geostorm, we just were reminded.
Geostorm's a classic one.
Jerry B.
There's got to be, isn't The Rock in one?
San Andreas.
San Andreas, yeah. There's a lot of really...
And Skyscraper too, right?
Yeah. I'm just wondering when we do that show, like when we walk away from it, are we gonna be like, oh man, this is actually a really great movie, this disaster film. I wonder, is it just Twister? I love Twister.
I don't know. I mean, I'm sure there's at least like we were talking about some of the fun stuff. Like I can't wait to talk about like best peripheral character death. The guy whose legs slowly melt into lava in Volcano. That's so like one of my favorite deaths of all time.
And then I also I want to do like something like the most shocking, because like the best thing about disaster films is when things get destroyed.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like the great epic shot of like New York going underwater, or like the Eiffel Tower tipping over, whatever.
Statue of Liberty tipping over. Yeah. There's so many good ones. So it's going to be a really fun topic. Be sure to tune in for that next week. And like you said, patreon.com/teamaction if you want to submit at the captain or above levels. Send it in and we would love to share it on the show. Yeah. So here we go. These are the ratings for the 6 movies at hand. We actually did think about bringing in the 1977 animated version of The Hobbit. I think after reviewing it, both of us decided probably just doesn't really belong in this conversation. It's just so different. It feels like a kid's movie. It's really driven by like the songs, and the songs are very old, and it just like
The animation is a little tough here and there. It's not that it's bad. It's actually, I remember watching it as a kid and thinking it was pretty sweet. But we are actually going to just talk about these 6 at hand. So, starting with the ratings and rankings here on Rotten Tomatoes and IMDb.
Yeah, the last place ranking film, 59% here. You got The Hobbit, Battle of the Five Armies coming in second. 64%, you've got The Hobbit, the first one, An Unexpected Journey. The middle film in that trilogy gets a 74%, coming in third to last, The Desolation of Smaug. Then you get into the original trilogy. Fellowship of the Ring, 92%. Return of the King, Best Picture winner, 93%. And The Two Towers at 95%, with Return of the King at an 8.9 overall on IMDb as the highest.
And all 3 of those movies are in the top 15 of the 250.
And even the Battle of the Five Armies, which has a 59 on Tomatoes, still has a 7.4 on IMDb. So people just have a real affection, obviously, for this world, and they're much more apologetic for the things that don't work. And so I do want to jump in and kind of throw this out to you guys who are about to get into this with us. We've got a lot of different categories to go through to kind of break down these movies for you. And I think you and us and anybody watching or listening kind of knows it's extremely unlikely that a Hobbit movie is going to take the top spot. I think we all kind of know this. So what we're going to try to do is really celebrate the things that are great and also the things that are kind of absurd about all the movies. Because every single movie has at least something to point out that's a good or a bad.
And also, I think in the conversation of this show being the best and the worst, I think it would be a disservice to the listeners if we didn't just kind of talk about, like you said, some of the things that don't work in all of them. But specifically, I think we will focus on like why The Hobbit just didn't really work for most everyone out there. And you guys will kind of see that through these topics that we have. But there's a lot of fun stuff in here. The first one that we're going to be going through, because we don't care about the tomato score, we don't care about the IMDb score, we care about our own system. And when you look at Lord of the Rings, it's like, what matters in Lord of the Rings? Like, when you look at that franchise, like, what things stand out to you?
Well, yeah, when we talked about it, it was like, okay, because show to show, you guys are starting to notice, we try to now tailor the best and the worst categories to the topic at hand. I think the show works better when we do it that way.
Definitely.
And it's more fun that way. So one of the biggest things is it's epic. These huge epic movies that have these massive set pieces and huge collisions. There's always good versus evil, orcs, goblins, swords, the spear.
The spear.
And so one of the things that we really started with is like the battles. Where the best, the worst battle. And not every movie has a huge battle. Some of them have like a fight, sort of, and some of them have like a straight up World War II level battle.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, because when you look at An Unexpected Journey, it doesn't really have like a true, like even in the first Lord of the Rings, there's big battles in there, whether it's the cave troll or whether it's the battle at the very end. Like, those are pretty substantial and they're still pretty epic, even though they're not like war level.
Yeah.
But like in the first Hobbit, it's really just kind of like the trolls, and then there's a little bit with the goblins and all that. So when you talk about the best battle for me in Lord of the Rings, I want that grand scale. I want the epic. I want the music. I want the swell. I want that beautiful climax. And I think there is no better example than Helm's Deep.
And I think one of the reasons Helm's Deep works so well is that when you look at a battle, you want to watch a battle, and I would liken this to probably other film genres as well. Like, you take, for instance, the final battle in Endgame. Mm-hmm. I don't like it as much as I like the final battle in Infinity War because it's bigger. There's more going on. They have to try to fit more in. And I would say the same thing kind of happens in the biggest battles, the Five Armies and the Return of the King, whereas Helm's Deep, it feels a little smaller. You can see what's going on. It starts in the rain. It's dark. It's like what they're showing you is, okay, you get the this is one of my favorite tropes in all battles, the romance death, where the elf dies and Aragorn sees him die. Dude, oh my God. There's nothing better than a bromance death in a battle. Yeah. It's just like one of the best like fist pump moments when you're watching, right?
Yeah, I mean, that guy's like so honorable the whole time, but he's like, he's gonna die, guy. Like, you see him come in, you're like, that guy's definitely gonna die.
And Aragorn's like, no.
Aragorn's voice is one of my favorite things.
Incredible.
He's got some good stuff in there. So yeah, I think the Battle of Helm's Deep. I mean, you get Theoden, you get like for Wrath, for Ruin, for the Red Dawn.
Yeah,
you get Gimli blowing the horn. You have and it's also like the numerous aspects of it, right? Because you've got all of them kind of held up in the keep, right? You got Theoden, Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, all that. And then you have Frodo and Sam that are off wherever they are, like trying to deal with Nazgul and deal with Faramir. And then you also have Gandalf, who's just been gone with the Rohirrim, right? We don't know that he's going to show up quite yet, but we know he's going to show up eventually. All that coming together with the music and the sunlight and the shot, like, it is so magnificent.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid and I watched this movie in a theater, this battle was the reason it was my favorite Lord of the Rings movie for years.
Yeah.
My favorite has changed a number of times. It's every few years when I rewatch them, it'll shift. But for a long time, without a doubt, Helm's Deep was the reason this movie was the best. And I think there's so many things about it. When I was a kid, I loved him sliding down on the shield on the stairs.
Yeah.
That was cool. You have a lot of stuff like and some of the stuff is just distinctive, like the orc with like the football who's trying to like break through the line.
Yeah, like the Olympic torch,
Yeah.
like to blow up everything.
And Aragorn's like, bring him down,
Bring him down,
bring him
Legolas,
down,
Legolas.
He doesn't really sound like that.
He does sound just like that.
He sounds just like that.
I think that there are other sweet battles. You know, the one in Return of the King, it gets kind of lost on me because, like, it's sweet for a while, and then the ghosts show up, and they just kind of overwhelm everything.
Yeah.
And then, like, I think when we talk about the second trilogy, the Battle of the Five Armies kind of goes crazy.
Well, that one's so dumb because, I mean, the battle itself, there's some cool stuff going on. But number one, the CGI is just a problem. So there's just a lot of CG going on. Mm-hmm. And then there's something about the fact that, like, they don't do anything to elevate the dwarves' skill. Like, they just seem kind of slower and shorter, and, like, they wouldn't be as proficient. So when, like, the thing that turns the tide is 13 dwarves, like, running with short legs,
like into an ocean of orcs.
They're like, they can't be running that fast because, like, how could they be?
They're very small.
There's like 13 of them, and they're running, and it's like, this is going to turn the tide, and you know, there's a certain amount of, like, fantastical power that goes
like they're
along
they're the greatest of the dwarf warriors.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
So, like, they're gonna, but there's just that battle lacks the sort of tangible moments that I think you get out of Helm's Deep. Helm's Deep sort of just has everything. It really does.
Yeah, it really does. And you get so many sweet moments with all of your characters, which is great. You still have comedy in there with Gimli. Like, it just has everything that you want. So that's the best.
Gandalf shows up on the hill, by the way, on the seventh day. Yeah, right. Because I also love
first slide on the seventh day.
I love in Two Towers when Gandalf has that line in the woods when they're like, you know, he's like, I know the Grey, that was my name, and then he's like, Gandalf the White, I come back to you now. The turn of the tide. And so when he says that line, it always gets me because it brings me. And then when you see him on the hill, you're like, it is the turn of the tide. Gandalf's here.
I think Theoden is like one of the most under-celebrated great characters in the trilogy. I love Theoden King so much. He has such a good death in the third one. He has such a great speech in this one. He's just awesome. And I also think that, like, how sweet he is early in Two Towers, the Grim of Wormtongue, is, like, amazing.
And some of the best stuff in Two. I actually think it's really interesting. What's that actor's name? Bernard King? Is that his name?
Yeah.
King?
Is that Bernard King?
I think
he's the elf?
No, as Theoden, I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
I was gonna say, and I just. He's one of those actors whose face I know from Theoden, and I can't really think of almost anything else he's in.
I've always said that he should be getting so many more roles, and he never got any love, like, at all.
Yeah.
All right, so another big part of Lord of the Rings is not only battles, but how about baddies, the villains, the best and the worst of the villains out there. Obviously, you know, there's the big ones. There's Sauron, there's Saruman, there's, you know, the Witch King. There's so many out there. The Goblin King, you know, Azog or whatever in the trilogy. You know, there's so much. Smaug. But for all the good, there are some bad. What's your best villain?
My best villain, I think, is going to be the Nazgul in general, and I think that includes the Witch King of Angmar. God, if I could have a voice as sweet as any of the wizards when I talked,
I mean, I'd take Saruman's.
You take
for sure.
You would take Saruman's.
I mean, if I couldn't have Gandalf's, I would definitely want his. I don't want Radagast's.
We should start a new podcast.
What if you got Radagast? That was the. You're like, I'll take any wizard, and you get him.
That's the gamble. And we should do a podcast where we only talk in Saruman and Gandalf's voice and see how long we can hold that one up. I think that my favorite is it's the Nazgul, and it includes the Witch King, and I think it's because from the very first movie, from Fellowship, really all the way through the end. They're menacing and they're frightening in a way that I think very few of the villains are.
Yeah.
They seem, you know, when they're hiding in the very first movie and he's on the horse and you feel the sort of the weight of the boots.
Yeah.
And they're chasing them and they have to take the boat.
Shot so incredibly.
Oh my God. And they get on the boat and you can't get in the water. And it's like, what's great about that is it sets up, you know this guy's never going to stop. You know that this, and so when they finally stab Frodo, you know, and like it just builds when you see them flying on the dragon looking things in the third one.
So sweet.
Gandalf comes in with the staff with the light. There's just so many scenes and so many moments that I just love with the Nazgul, and I think it's especially cool too that they're like. These are the corrupted fallen men. Yeah. Because we're all people watching this.
Yep.
Right? So it's like these people represent me if I was driven with greed to be evil. You know, that's me.
Yeah, and I think it's fascinating, like when you even talk about like how the rings are distributed and like why men got so many, and it's because I think because men are so weak and they're all gonna die, they're mortal, whereas like the elves get like 3 because they just live forever. You know, I just think it's really a cool thing that they did there. And you know, it's funny, we didn't do best death.
Oh,
but yours would have just been Boromir. It would have just been a waste of time. But I do have to say the Witch King's death is so sick. I am no man. Like she stabs him in the face and his helmet like starts like
that's a sweet
going
one.
in on itself. It's so sweet. For me, the best villain. It was really tough because there's so many great ones out there, but I had to go with Gollum. He's the OG. He's like the true great villain of the franchise. He has all the things that you love in a villain, like just like cosmetically when he's like, you know, he just looks disgusting. Like you just kind of hate to look at him. He's ugly, he's gross, he's dirty, he's grimy, his teeth are messed up. But then when they show Andy Serkis as him in Return of the King at the beginning, and you see the turn happen, you see him start to lose his hair and all that. It's like you feel so bad for him, but he's so unredeemably evil.
Well, what's so great about that too is like you almost can ask, because both of our pick for like sort of favorite or best, like I love Boromir, and he technically in the end is a villain. I mean, he's a hero, but he turns out to be a villain in the end, and so does Gollum, right? But he starts as just a regular guy. In both cases, the reason the story is so good is because you see them corrupted. You watch it happen, so you believe, like you understand and believe this person's turn and why they're evil. And I think it's the thing that makes Gollum so good, because when you said it at first, I was like, is Gollum really a villain? It's like he's definitely a villain. Yeah. But like he also is, you know, the way that Frodo relates to him, the way that Frodo has sympathy for him, because he's like, Sam, you don't know what this is like.
You don't know what this feels like.
That's just such an underrated, incredible part of the relationship.
And I think it's honestly one of the most incredible things about Elijah Wood's performance in the whole trilogy is like, you know, for the longest time when I was younger, I used to say the worst character in Lord of the Rings is Frodo. Yeah. Because he's such a whiny bitch. Like, just do your job. Indeed. Just do what everyone else in the whole friggin' trilogy franchise is doing. You're the only one. But then it's like, that's the point. That's the weight of the ring. And I think he does such a good job. I mean, the relationship between them is like, you know, that could have just been Frodo if he just kept the ring, right?
It would have been Frodo.
Yeah, it would have been Frodo.
You can see Frodo starting to go crazy at the end, and it's the best. I think it's probably one of the reasons why they thought that the Thorin turn would work as well as they tried to make it work. Right. I think they're probably trying to lean into the same idea, and you can see moments of it working. Yeah, it's but it's not as strong of a turn. So, how about you for your worst villain? What do you got?
So, I have to just say, it's Azog. Yes. He's like the big he's the big bad for all 3 movies of the, I guess the prequel we'll call them, but of the Hobbit franchise. And like I just don't like the pale-faced orc with the mace through his arm that then gets upgraded to a sweet sword. Like, what did that surgery feel like?
He's got the thing coming out of the elbow, and he's got it in the front. Like, it feels like he'd be like eating, and he would just like cut his leg off. He would just be like stab himself,
or like turn a corner and kill someone on accident.
How's he stay so jacked? He can't do planks.
Exactly. You know? How do you stay jacked without planking, Azog? And like he's just, I don't know, like for all the reasons of why the orc in the first one was so sick. Yeah. What's his name again? Lurtz.
He's like, and he's a person. That's what's great about that original.
And that's how it should have been with Azog. Yeah. Should have just been like the same exact way that they designed Lurtz. They should have just done that with Azog and made him a pale orc. But instead, he just like talks too much and he sucks and he gets an upgraded weapon and like he's fake looking. Yeah. You know, he just doesn't matter to me. I just didn't like him.
I'll do you one better. I'm going to go with his idiot son, Bolg. He's like a clone. He's like a clone of Azog. He looks the same, except he's like more jacked up. And then he puts like a skull over his dick and on his shoulder also. He's like, I'm going to put these skulls to look cool. And he's got like some metal over his head.
He's got like metal sticking out of his body all over the place.
He's just, I mean, they literally were like, we're going to make like all of the big battles at the end of this are going to like basically rest on these 2 CG kind of identical looking, like they literally just look like they're characters out of a video game.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And then, you know, of course, Legolas goes in and does his thing. I mean, Bolg at least like kills Killy or Philly or whatever his name is. One of the dwarves with the names ILI. But yeah, they just like, it was like, oh, I know what we can do. Let's bring in this pale orc with a mace for an arm that Thorin hurt. And then like, oh, but he's not evil enough. Let's just add in his son.
That'll
That'll be sick.
We'll have two of them.
They'll both be pale orcs.
Yeah, and they never even like really established that it's his son, I don't think.
Yeah, I think we only figured it out when we just looked it up online.
Reading about it, yeah. But it's just like that. I don't know. Because that character does not exist in the book, is my understanding.
Bolg or Azog or both?
Azog does not exist, is my understanding. Or if he does, he's talked about, but he's never in the book. He's like never actually in the story.
Yeah, well, he's not in the 1977 version of The Hobbit either. So
I can only imagine. If he was in the 77 version, he probably would have had like a song, a dance or something.
Greatest adventure. Yeah, that whole soundtrack is so weird. All right, so let's get into some more sweet stuff here. Another big part of Lord of the Rings. Talk about the Fellowship. Talk about all the dwarves, his characters. There's so many. We talk about this. This is like probably we could have done the greatest ensemble cast in a trilogy. Also, if we wanted for the original three. There's so many good characters.
Before we get into our best and worst, just because we're not going to get to talk about so many characters, give me a couple honorable mentions that never get talked about, who are just characters that, even if they're small, that you particularly love.
I mean, Theoden is like my number one.
That's like your top.
There was a while where I just said Theoden was my favorite character, period. Yeah. He's probably my number one. You mentioned him earlier today, so I'm going to steal it. I think Grima Wormtongue is one of the greatest characters.
He's an incredible character.
So awesome.
Yeah.
And then I think it's really funny that you don't really like the Treants that much because I love Treebeard.
You love Treebeard?
Treebeard is so sweet. I think that the extended version, it's like a little bit too much time with the Ents.
Yeah.
And I do think that like when the Ents are all talking and it takes them for like there's a moment there where I'm like, all right, can we just like But it's also the Hobbits are doing the same thing. Like, can we just speed this up, man?
Yeah.
But yeah, I really like them. And then I think Yeah, those are probably my go-tos.
I think my honorable mentions probably would go to Denethor, John Noble.
Yeah,
I love John Noble. I love kind of all his scenes. He's such a
fuck.
We were joking earlier. It's like the line from Dewey Cox: "The wrong kid died."
Kid died.
Like basically, it's like basically him the entire Return of the King. It's sort of amazing. I really love him. She doesn't really.
What's the girl's name? Is it Eowyn?
Yeah.
The one that,
Eowyn is.
I love her.
She's great.
Yeah.
I really love Galadriel. I think she's great.
Even in
Even
the Hobbit trilogy,
not quite as much. And then I do love Faramir.
Faramir's sweet. You feel bad for him.
You totally do. Yeah, these are all characters I love. I mean, there's just so many characters. Again, it's like I feel like we could do a 3-hour podcast just like every character from every movie.
Oh, I could literally talk about every character for like at least 10 minutes and just like talk about all the good and all the bad, maybe. But that being said, those are my honorable mentions. My best character ever, no questions. It's Samwise Gamgee.
I knew you were going to say
Samwise the Brave.
Yeah, you've been talking about him for years.
There's just no one better than Sam. Frodo couldn't have done it without Sam. He literally saves his ass back to back to back to back to back all the time. Like, he goes back to Frodo when Frodo casts him out, when Frodo like basically betrays him. He kills Shelob for him. Like, he fights Shelob, I mean. And also, he gives the best speech, in my opinion, in the entire franchise at the end of Two Towers. Like, that there's good left in this world and it's worth fighting for.
It's a great speech.
But I think, Mr. Frodo, I do understand. I know now. Folk in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going. Because they were holding on to something. What are we holding on to, Sam? There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo. And it's worth fighting for.
And then I truly think in the first movie, it's maybe one of the most like heartbreakingly beautiful bromance moments I've ever seen. When he's like, I've got to go alone. He's like, you're right, and I'm coming with you. And then he just walks out in the water, and he can't swim. He just walks, and he's just drowning. He just drowns. And then, of course, in the third one, PLD is just reminding us, if you can't carry it, or I can't carry it, but I can carry you.
But I can carry you.
Like, come on, man. Like, there is no one better than Sam in the whole trilogy.
I know.
All six of them.
And his journey, what's wonderful about Sam's journey, they kind of try to mimic, I think, a lot of what makes Sam wonderful with Bilbo, actually.
Yeah.
They feel very similar in a lot of their moments. Like, when Sam has the moment in Fellowship, and he's like, one more step, or is it Does he say it, or does Frodo say about one more step? This is the furthest I've ever been from the Shire.
I think it's Sam.
I think it's Sam.
I think it is.
I'm almost positive because like that feels very much just like Bilbo's attitude.
Yeah.
So much of they feel very similar in a lot of ways. You know,
I really did like Martin Freeman as Bilbo. I thought he did a really good job with what he was given. I love his speech in The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey, where he's like, you know, because this is what reminded me, you know, talking about his home, and I wish I was at home. I wish I had my pipe and this food and the eggs and all that. But then he's like, but that's why I have to stay, is because I want to be home and you don't have a home.
Right.
And it was such a great moment. I think that actually is, in my opinion, the best Bilbo moment in the entire Hobbit trilogy.
I would say that the casting of Martin Freeman as Bilbo is the strongest single element that runs through those three movies. It anchors the movies enough that they're watchable because he's in all of them and he does a good job.
And I don't think Gandalf counts in that, right?
No, I mean,
like
Gandalf's great.
I mean,
but...
no, he is, but I mean, like, he was already from,
Yeah.
you know, the original. We already love him. It wasn't like a surprise.
Yeah,
that, you know,
and then so that's the thing that works. For me, I think my favorite character of all time. It's tough because I have the one that I want to go with, that I really do believe. And I'm gonna do it.
Know who it is? Yeah, it's always him.
It's Boromir. It's Sean Bean. Look, I love this character, and I love
My captain.
Yeah,
My king.
I love his death scene.
Oh.
I would have followed you, my brother. My captain. My king.
I mean, I almost went Gandalf. I would say that my backup here is Gandalf. And
So good.
And I love everything that Gandalf does. And Gandalf probably has my favorite speech in the whole thing. Honestly, when Frodo says, "I wish the ring had never come to me," and then Gandalf gives him the whole speech about, I can't even remember exactly the lines, but you know the one I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So when he's talking about killing Smeagol, and I love Gandalf, but Boromir for me is just, he's the character that when you're watching the first movie the first time, if you don't like, you know, I think I knew the story, but it was read to me as a child. So when I was watching, I wasn't totally connecting what I knew was going to happen. I was still watching these characters with a sense of like what's going to happen next. So when he turns finally in the end and he tries to take the ring from Frodo, it's so sad because you do know, you can see the weight, the pride that he's carrying with him and how much he wants to be this leader, you know, and he resents Aragorn so much. It's such a sad moment. And so then at the end when he, you know, he's like, forgive me. And he's fighting for the hobbits and God, the arrows,
the arrows are so sweet from Lurtz, and like
Yeah.
his turn on Frodo, and then when he realizes what he's done in that moment, it's like when he like feels the heartbreak and like the disgust with himself. Sean Bean does such an incredible job with like a very, very, I mean, that's a really difficult role, right? That character goes through so much in such a short period of time, and it's all so impactful.
Yeah.
And then Gandalf. I mean, Gandalf gives, I mean, not only is it that, you know, the speech of like what we do with the time that's given to us, which I think is the one you're talking about, but he also has like, you know, death is just another path.
It's a great speech.
You know, the glass
the
rolls
battle.
over and all that.
Yeah.
Talking about death, so good. So those are our best characters. What about your worst character?
Oh God. I think for me, I was watching the Hobbit trilogy getting ready for this. I had seen it in theaters, but I hadn't seen it since it first came out. And they gave us like a Grima Wormtongue knockoff. This character, Alfred Lickspittle.
Yep.
And he's in a lot of scenes.
They should have just cast the same dude. It would have been so much better.
He's in these scenes with Stephen Fry, who's like the master of the boat town.
Yeah.
And he's like his assistant, and he's like this sniveling little piece of trash. But he survives when Smaug
over and over
and he keeps surviving, and he keeps like sticking around, and then finally in the end when he's like, go make sure the women and children are hiding and come back with your sword, and then they find him and he's dressed like in women's clothing with like gold in the brassiere of his
golden bosoms.
Yeah, and they're like, and then he just runs away. And that's it. And then he doesn't even die. He's just like a useless character who shows up in scene after scene after scene. I felt like they were trying to hit like a comedy quota or something.
Yeah, or like try to like, bring some levity to it. But then like Luke Evans, because like even when Luke Evans is like quote unquote friends with them and he's like, take the kids, you know, like protect the women and blah, blah, blah. He's like Alfred is still like an asshole to the kids, like right in front of him. It's so weird. And then, there's no comeuppance. I was even saying, because I recently watched 300, and there's that moment where Gerard Butler, he's like, Ephaltes, the guy that betrays them. He's like, Ephaltes, may you live forever. And it's like, it's such a good line. I wish there was something like that with him that was just like, I hope you know what a piece of shit you are, and the only reason you're alive is because we've let you live. But it doesn't happen. So yeah, I agree. I hated him. I don't know why they kept going to him. I was like, it felt like a weird reality show where he somehow kept winning the camera over, and I was like, shouldn't you have storyboarded this to not go back to Alfred Lickspittle?
Have just gotten crushed with Stephen Fry?
Yeah.
Like, why not?
Yeah.
Like,
or
why
like drown in the water when he threw him in there? Anything. Yeah, so mine is like, I think pretty controversial, and I felt this after watching The Hobbit the first time.
Yeah.
And I felt it again this time through, even though I think he did a better job than I gave him credit for. I hate Thorin Oakenshield.
Yeah.
I do. I like,
it's tough.
I don't like the casting. I understand the casting because I think they wanted to get a character kind of like a Guy Pearce-esque person that like could be good or bad.
Yeah.
Right? When you look at Thorin, you can see he could be a bad guy or a good guy, which I think is really important when you get into the Desolation of Smaug and he starts to like tilt. He starts to go to the dark side, if you will. I just don't like him though. I don't like the whole Oakenshield thing. He like defended Azog with a piece of wood and then he lost it. I think that he's like a pretty useless leader. I don't really understand. Like, I get that he's the king by blood and all that, and so I get the whole like allegiance to him. But there's not many moments of like watching that trilogy where I'm like, man, that's why he's their king. You know, even when they talk it, like I feel like the dwarves do a better job of talking about how much they love him than Peter Jackson or those movies ever do showing us why we should love him.
Right. I mean, that's totally true. And I think, you know, one of the issues that these movies has, a lot of people have talked about, is that, you know, there's a lot of movie. There's 8+ hours of movie with the source material that does not stretch as long. And so with Thorin, the strongest stuff is when Thorin is starting to go mad. When he goes crazy, it's more annoying. But when he's starting to lose it and he's starting to make decisions and be like, that's the stuff that I think works the best for him as a character. And I just feel like a lot of the rest of what he does is just kind of boring. Like,
yeah, and I think like what you're saying there is true about those things working the best. I have it written down here in the notes, or like notes I was taking when I was watching it, and it's at the end of the first Hobbit where they do that like gotcha thank you thing. He's like, Bilbo, like, what did I say to you? You don't belong here. You're a burglar. Like, you don't deserve this. He like
I've
literally
never been more wrong in my life.
And then he did, like, what? Like, how theatrical could this possibly have been in the writing? Like, I hate when they do that in movies anyway, when you know they're going to thank them, but they started off by being like a dick.
Yeah.
But then when they go that deep into literally repeating, he's like, what did I say? And then he repeats everything that he said. And then he does exactly what you just did. He's like, I've never been more wrong. And I was just like, I hate you, man. I hate you. Like, you're useless.
Bilbo's like, why'd you fake me out like that? That was
right? Like, today's been stressful enough, man. Like, come on. But yeah, it's tough because I definitely like, there's probably someone else that I could hate more, but for how important Thorin is, I really just didn't like him.
Well, I think so. This kind of brings us nicely as a transition to our next segment on the show, and this is a segment we started to kind of introduce the last couple episodes, and this is a segment that we're calling "What Were They Thinking?"
Scream and M. Night Shyamalan really helped us come up with the "What Were They Thinking" segment.
So, what were they thinking? And I think we can actually kind of start with what I was just talking about. Why is this 3 movies? That's the. I mean, look, if you don't know, Guillermo del Toro was deep into pre-production on probably 2 movies. He was going to do like essentially 2 films. He wanted the first film to mostly focus on the story in The Hobbit, and then he wanted the second film to be like connective tissue between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. So he was going to have it be kind of a transition. And there's tons and tons and tons of stuff out there about what he had worked on. He was in pre-production for 3 years on this. He talks about walking away from the project and how when he gets asked about it, it's like grieving the death of a loved one. He was so attached to the project. Yeah. And so, in the end, Peter Jackson is announced as the director shortly before they go into production, and he's to make 3 movies.
And like with no prep time.
So the animatronic combined with CGI stuff that Guillermo was trying for, Peter Jackson went full CGI. Mm-hmm. The like miniatures to act as backgrounds didn't happen. They went full CGI. And there's so much stuff in this when you're watching where it's just like, why is there another movie after this? This really feels like this whole story could have been condensed into 1 2-hour, 45-minute movie with a really strong lead that would have been a great piece to go along with. But instead, the whole trilogy to me feels like they're doing they're trying to do an impression of Lord of the Rings the whole time.
They're trying to catch lightning in a bottle again.
Yeah.
Like, they're trying to do that by recycling the same things that worked in the first one, which, like, you know, for just what you said about, like, the fact that a different director was in charge for as long as he was in pre-production, then Peter Jackson just came in right before they started shooting. Like, how many times have we mentioned on this episode already that he prepped and storyboarded and started building stuff years in advance to shooting? That he'd already done 3 years of work before day one of shooting of the first Lord of the Rings. So, like, and then you look at Guillermo and the way that he is as a director, you listen to him speak on podcasts or whatever, like, the dude is a genius.
Yeah.
But he's also, like, a genius in his very own specific way. So, like, imagine walking into a kitchen halfway through, like, a Michelin chef cooking dinner, and you walk in and they're like, all right, go ahead and finish this.
Right.
Like, well, I'm going to start over because I don't know what any of this shit is.
And the studio was probably like, yeah, I mean, because there was a bunch of people who were up for the job, who were in talks to be director. One of whom, by the way, was Brett Ratner, which is hilarious to me. There was like a bunch of names that were up for to go do the Lord of the Rings films. And in the end, Jackson was announced because you have to think that Warner Brothers was like, this is the safest.
This is the guy.
This is the safest choice. This is who did the first ones. He'll be able to do a really good job. And it's like, just because you're a creative genius doesn't mean you can just do anything, anywhere, anytime. Like, Tom Brady is the only Tom Brady. Most people don't get to, like, go somewhere at the end of their career and just be like, oh, I'm still great.
I'm just going to win another ring.
I'm great no matter where I go or what I do or how I do it. Like, most people, there are limitations on their greatness.
I definitely think that the Guillermo, I mean, obviously this is revisionist history because we have the 3 Hobbit movies, but I definitely think the Guillermo version of 2 movies that he did would have been so much sweeter.
So much sweeter.
It would have been so good. So what were they thinking? How about, why is this 3 movies? There's only 300 pages in The Hobbit and there's 1,200 pages in one of the Lord of the Rings books. Why are there 3 movies
There's
here?
such huge amount of stuff in these movies that's just not in the book. And they took liberties in the original films as well, but there's so much stuff, like we mentioned with Azog, where they're just... Bard, for instance, is not even introduced as a character until he shoots Smaug. Yeah. It doesn't even happen in the Hobbit book. He's like really doesn't have much character. So there's a lot of stuff like that.
So I think one thing that was interesting that you mentioned before, and you also talked about another part of this in Legolas, like sliding down the stairs on the shield. He has a sweet moment in every movie.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's stabbing someone with the arrow and then shooting the arrow in the first one, whether it's sliding down the stairs in Helm's Deep, or taking out the elephant riders in Return of the King, or killing Azog's son, or killing the giant creature in The Hobbit. Like, he is by far and away the sweetest fighter in all of the movies,
For
right?
sure.
So when you look at Lord of the Rings, and you look at Aragorn, he's a human. He's a man. You don't really you expect him to be like a scrappy fighter, rough around the edges, gonna get banged up a little bit. Legolas should be like an untouchable, graceful, like perfect, accurate warrior, right? Gimli, this is where I think they miss, right?
Yeah.
So you said on the show, like the dwarves felt kind of incompetent and kind of useless throughout the 3 Hobbit movies. They kept
really
getting bailed out by Bilbo and by Gandalf and by other situations. So, when we watched the original first Avenger, Captain America, and then when we watched the next Captain America, Winter Soldier, we were able to see how awesome Cap's fighting changed from 1 to 2.
Yeah.
How much they had kind of evolved what it meant to be a superhuman. So if Legolas has all these awesome scenes as an elf, and then you have Aragorn doing, again, his thing as a human, why didn't they give the dwarves, like, an awesome, tangible, brute strength? Or, like, why couldn't they, like, pound the ground and, like, make things fall? Or why weren't they, like, more badass with their axes? Or there was a way to cater their fighting to make it specialized that would have made, I think, Gimli sweeter and would have made all of the dwarves sweeter throughout all 3 Hobbit movies. Like, you can't just make Legolas the coolest fighter in everything.
Totally, because like they don't do anything to make the dwarves feel like they would be capable or competent or would be able to defend anything. Like, in fact, the entire...
Like, watching it feels like the elves should have just ruled Middle-earth.
For sure. I mean, what it feels like when you watch the dwarves is like they constantly are getting themselves into like, oh, shucks situations, and then getting saved by Gandalf.
Yeah.
Like, they're like, oh, we got captured again. Like, Bilbo's going to have to break us out of jail now. If not for Bilbo, like, we're not going to get out of jail. Or like, oh, Gandalf was able to save us from these trolls that were going to eat us.
Or like, so they're dwarves, right? They build these underground cities, and they like are supposed to be like really good with like, building stuff, right?
Yeah.
That's what dwarves do. So like, even in Helm's Deep, right? One of my favorite moments in all the movies And Gimli, one of my favorite characters, when he's like, "You have to toss me.
Yeah.
You have to toss me. I cannot jump the distance." He's like, and then he's like, "Don't tell the elf." I wouldn't change that for anything.
No.
But what if instead Gimli had like a cool little device that helped him swing over? Or what if dwarves could just like leap that far because they were that strong?
I think the strength is the thing that they miss. I think that's the place that, and probably because Gimli didn't have it, they felt like they couldn't give it to the dwarves.
For sure.
But like if they also could have cheated it a little bit because Gimli is pretty strong. He's able to kill tons of orcs and stuff.
Yeah.
If they had just made the dwarves strong, like you could just see them like punch a door and the door like rattle and break or something. I don't know. I
think they tried it with that one bald dwarf, and he was like just headbutting everyone, and he kept like killing orcs by headbutting their like metal helmets.
Yeah.
But I just, what were they thinking, man? Let the dwarves have some sweet dwarven power.
Yeah. And speaking on the note of what were they thinking with the dwarves, how did they manage to fit? Not just 13 dwarves, okay? And a hobbit and a wizard. But not one, but two songs into Bilbo's house to start out The Hobbit. How do they fit two into the same scene?
Like, you know what? It's been 10 years since you got any sweet Lord of the Rings action. Let's open this one up with some killer dwarf songs at Bilbo's about making dinner.
They're like, that's what Bilbo Baggins hates. I was like, okay, I hate this movie. I was like, I hate this movie. I'm gonna make it through. It's okay. The song will be over soon. And then it's like, cut. It's like, the Lonely Mountain. And I was like, oh my God, can we get the fuck out of the Hobbit town, please? Like, what?
Greatest adventure.
And then Aragorn pops his head and he's like, the great.
Aragorn's song is sweeter. What's really funny is this is what Benjamin Bateman hates. It sounds like they stole like South Park songs from that song. I don't know. What's really funny is in the 1977 version, there's also 2 songs or 3 songs sung at Bilbo's house, and I think at least one of them is the exact same. The "What Would Bilbo Baggins" whatever. That song's in that version. Okay, how about this then? For what were they thinking? There's no desolation in the Desolation of Smaug.
Oh, right, because
how about the conversation of Smaug?
He goes and he meets Benedict Cumberbatch, who, by the way, is arguably my favorite part of the entire Hobbit trilogy.
So sweet.
He's so sweet. Like,
and also, if not for anything, I think the best video footage might just be
him
crawling around in the room in the suit. If you guys haven't seen it, Benedict Cumberbatch, Smaug, like green room or whatever, you'll see him like doing the bodily movements of the dragon. It's really awesome.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, that guy's a real thespian, and he's putting in the he's putting in the time there. But yeah, I think like you get to the end of Desolation of Smaug, and you're like, okay, like he's gonna destroy some stuff. There's gonna be some desolation. This movie is called The Desolation of Smaug, and it gets to the end of the movie, and he's like, I'm flying towards Lake Town. See you in a year. Like, it's like, what?
Right? They're like, let's gold plate him,
and
then have him fly away. Also, so quick question. This is a tangential thought. Why did that whole statue just melt and fall on him?
I was thinking it must have been something to do
like heating everything up and then breaking it open.
Yeah. Well, so what I was thinking is maybe they had the casing full like built, and if you were going to erect the statue, that's why they had the stuff running,
right? So,
I think
fill it with gold and
it hadn't dried yet, so then I think they broke the thing down. It's pretty badly explained because I'm just guessing.
I think you did it. I think you did a pretty good job explaining it. But also that was CG, just like everything else in this movie and everything else in this trilogy. There's a moment in the Battle for the Five Armies where Bilbo and Gandalf step aside to have a conversation.
Yeah.
And then you can literally see behind them, like the troops marching. It's a CG like loop of troops marching. Yeah. It's like the perspective is all wrong. They look like too big, and they look like they're in the foreground. It looked like when Trump was doing like the green screen videos at the White House. It looked exactly like that, but it was Bilbo and Gandalf.
He's probably a huge fan of these films.
He loves them. He loves Thorin.
Yeah, sure. He's a big fan of Battle of the Five Armies. He's a big battle guy. No, I think that the CG is arguably probably the single worst part of the entire Hobbit trilogy.
Yeah.
Because there's so many moments when you're watching where you're like, Lurtz is just an ugly man with makeup and like fake teeth and hair, and like he looks jacked and he looks menacing and he has a big bow and he's scary. And there are very large humans that act in movies, stuntmen that are 7 feet tall. Like there's lots of them. They hire
Nash,
them in
baby.
game, right? So like, why not just make like Bolg and Azog if you're gonna have them just people and like CGI, you know, like put a CGI arm on them if you need to.
Joseph Gatt
Yeah.
is a friend of ours. He's albino.
Yeah.
And he's gigantic.
He's jacked, yeah.
He could have literally been Azog.
Yeah.
Right?
Totally. It's really weird that they chose to go with so much. And the places that I noticed it, it's not just in big battles or notable characters. It's even like when Radagast is like, they won't catch my rabbits on my thing. And you're like, you just look like you're lifted from the intro sequence of a video game from like 2011. This is
actually
really bad.
hate Radagast.
Yeah,
he probably should have been my least favorite character. The dude's he's like just covered in bird shit.
Yeah.
And he's useless. PLD I can see is sad, but like, why, dude? Radagast actually sucks.
Like a conversation with Radagast is like, hey, bro, you've got some shit in your beard. He's like, I know. that's like,
you're damn right I do. All right, so those are the what were they thinkings. As you can see, we pulled them all from the Hobbit trilogy. So now we're going to do some unintentional comedy that we found in the first 3 movies. I think we could probably leave the Hobbit trilogy alone for this segment because there is some unintentional comedy in the first 3.
And this is what's sweet about it is like, because like I love these movies so much, but what happens when you watch any movie that you love this many times?
A million times.
You just start to notice certain things. So one of the things that I love is at the beginning or the first like hour of Fellowship. I think it's the first hour of Fellowship where Gandalf goes to talk to Saruman. And they end up having like a wizard fight with their staffs, and it's like a lot of just like we used to talk about old dude fighing, like Harrison Ford like punching people in Air Force One. This is kind of the same idea, where it's just like close up on like Christopher Lee's face being like, and then like close up on Gandalf's face being like, and just like holding staff, and then even the better part is when you're watching with subtitles, it's just like. It just says like both grunting. like I saw that like a bunch of times.
I have to admit too, when he gets like thrown on the ground and starts spinning around, it's kind of hilarious. Ian McKellen was probably like, I could only do it a few times. it was pretty awesome. Also, talking about sweet voices, whether it's in the first one where it's like an ass. What I mean, get them up.
Get them up. But this evening, these hills will be swarming with orcs.
Swarming with orcs. Or if it's in the third one, when it's like, all right, after that sweet battle.
Yeah.
And, like, how did anyone convince anyone that song was what needed to happen at the end of Return of the King?
And it cuts to all the characters. Like, it cuts to Eowyn and Faramir, and they're like...
I would have loved if they cut to someone they were just asleep. Because, like, why is this happening? It's literally, like, one of the worst moments in the entire trilogy, and then one of the best moments in the entire trilogy. Because My Friends, You Bow to No One, like, always makes me tear up.
Yeah.
When the hobbits are trying to bow to him.
Great moment, yeah.
But, like, but he sings that song.
Aragorn's singing voice, it's sweet.
Let us together rebuild this world, that we may share in the days of peace.
There's a lot of like unintentional comedy in the singing in this franchise. Some work better than others. When John Noble's sitting there eating the tomatoes, just like getting all over his face.
They're like explosive. Yeah, it's pretty
when
sweet.
Pippin is singing, that's a really good moment. All the singing is strong.
Yeah, all the singing is good. And then I think like there was this clip that circulated online a few years ago where they slowed down the end of Return of the King and they like do their own dubbing over it. It's hilarious because it's a lot of really slow motion overreactions of happiness from like the hobbits, from Gimli, from Gandalf. He's like,
well, it's because there's just like, it's just a lot of like, it's a lot of stuff where you're watching and it's like Gandalf, it's like just really ridiculous looking. But yeah, I mean that's the stuff that when you watch makes you laugh. One other kind of unintentional comedy moment that came for me while I was watching Battle of the Five Armies actually It's when they decided they were like, we're gonna have all of the wizards and powerful like fight the Nazgul, and so like you have like Galadriel and she's there to save Gandalf, and then like Christopher Lee's like, I'm here, and then like what the hell's his name?
Hugo Weaving.
Yeah. And he's like, I'm here too, and they start fighting, and it just is like a weird video game sequence.
It's so well because you're looking at this, you're like, you guys are all 10 years older than you were before, and you're supposed to like. This shouldn't happen.
It looks like my parents doing like a Zumba class or something. I just like, what the fuck is this? Like, I just like the special effects. Like, I just was like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah, I really did not like that fighting scene. Also, in the Hobbit trilogy, when did the ring start to be able to like hear people speaking?
Oh, because the spiders?
Yeah, the spiders?
Yeah.
That wasn't a thing in the first three. Like, when you put on the ring, you could understand other languages, right?
No, I mean, you know what's funny, too? And I actually read a little bit about this. So in The Hobbit, the original book, there's actually nothing evil about the ring. It's a magical ring that can make Frodo... or that makes Bilbo invisible.
Right.
And they introduced it being evil in the later movie, but they decided they wanted to introduce that in the earlier movie to tie them together. But like because it's really strange that they lean in the Hobbit movies to. It's like they're telling a different story, and you can just tell when they're like, okay, we're going to insert this piece of connective tissue to make this feel like it.
Right.
It's supposed to set up Lord of the Rings now.
Whereas when I'm watching it, I'm like, the ring should be like literally just like a cool thing.
Yeah.
Like there should be no connection between that and anything
sure.
evil yet. We need to get there. So yeah, those are some of the best villains, best characters, best battles, but also some of the what were they thinkings and some unintentional comedy there. Now that we have broken down all of our categories, you've heard our at least rankings of these topics. Now we're going to get into the actual best and the worst of Middle Earth. So now we want you guys to also get involved with this, whether it's on Twitter or down below in the YouTube comments. Let us know what your ranking is of all 6 of these movies. Do you think that one of the Hobbit movies deserves to be the #1 spot? I mean, we saw someone on your Twitter today say that The Unexpected Journey was their favorite in all 6 movies. So take a screenshot of your rankings, write them out, type up a list, tag us on Twitter at Andrew Ghai, at Ben Bateman Media. We are at Team Action Show collectively. And yeah, let's get into the rankings here.
So coming in 6th place, last of the group, you got The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies.
Yeah.
Strongest parts of this movie, probably, I guess, like the Thorin going full crazy at the end, I guess. And
The
Smaug.
love between Toriel and
God.
Keith.
Oh, we didn't even talk about that. And then the one dwarf is like, Lee Pace is just like,
Or elf. Yeah.
The one elf. He's like, your love is not real. And then 20 minutes later, she's like, why does it hurt so much? She's like, because it's real.
Because
I was
it's
like, what?
real.
I was like, what is this? What is
Like,
this?
you're the king. You're the okay. All right, cool. That makes sense. Yeah. And also like the Battle of the Five Armies. There was like this whole thing. I was watching this video. It was like the second unit director was Andy Serkis. They were like just like shooting a battle for like weeks.
Yeah.
But they didn't know what they were doing. Like they didn't know what the battle. So then they just scrapped the whole thing. They just like cut the whole thing and then started over from the beginning. That movie, as you heard with how gnarly the production was, it happens on screen as well. Like the confusion in production translated perfectly to the confusion on screen.
Well, and then we talked about this a second ago with the Desolation of Smaug thing, but it's really weird that the Desolation of Smaug component and that part of the story, including Smaug dying, happens at the beginning of the movie as opposed to the climax to end the Desolation of Smaug. Like,
right.
Because there's no need for it at the beginning of Five Armies because the story basically... It's like, here's 15 minutes, and then here's the rest of the movie.
Right, yeah. It should have been like, Smaug dies at the end of 2, and then 2 ends with like all of the other people coming for their share of the dwarf wealth.
And I think it's probably just because they needed a cliffhanger to make us show up to watch the third movie because the first one was not reviewed as well, so people probably kind of knew this is... but that's the ranking on the 6th one.
So the 5th ranked movie here is going to be An Unexpected Journey. I think that there is some good stuff in here, right? You get to meet everybody. Gandalf is back. Martin Freeman does a great job. The songs are there. I think for me, what was kind of missing from the first one, I mean, if you look at Fellowship, it feels a lot kind of, like you said, more contained, a much smaller scale, all those things. You're building up this story, which is why 2 and 3 are so crazy. I understand that's kind of what they were going for in this first one, but there wasn't really a lot that grabbed me.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't think the trolls and the whole sunlight and the stone thing was that interesting. I really didn't like the Goblin King. I liked the attempt at making the goblins kind of like maybe the orcs like for the first trilogy, like maybe the goblins were going to be like the big baddies in this one, but they ended up not being it. It just felt like this movie was like just kind of vanilla, just kind of bland.
I think what's really interesting about this movie is that it's like you can feel the first half of this movie, or you can feel that there's a part of this movie that acts as the beginning of the story, and there's part of Desolation of Smaug that works as the story, and there's part of Five Armies that works as the story. And if you were to just tell that story, it's the book, and that's 3 hours. But there's so much extended stuff in each movie that it just draws these scenes out in a way that's just like so unnecessary.
You become like really unengaged. like for those
super
moments.
Unengaged. Like I think the thing about these movies that fails, the thing that fails so completely for me, and I noticed it from the beginning of rewatching Unexpected Journey, is like they introduced no less than like 20 to 30 new characters,
right?
And like 95% of them aren't likable and are interchangeable. Like there's no personality to almost any elf. The only one that really gets like Toriel gets some like real personality, and you get a little bit out of Thranduil, but even him, he's kind of just recycled.
Right, and then Legolas is like,
he's old. I mean, and you have all these 13.
He's young, actually.
He's young, yes. You have 13 dwarves, and like only 3 or 4 of which are actual characters, and even the ones who are actual characters, they just have a couple catchfasses they say here and there,
and like a couple moments to like hold on to. And I think also with oh man, what were you saying about the dwarves?
Just being so many characters introduced.
There's just like so many characters that are introduced, and like it's a lot to kind of like latch onto. Whereas like when you watch The Fellowship, it's like these are the 9, these are the people you care about, these are like this is why they're here. There was something else I was going to say about it, but I guess I just can't remember. Unexpected Journey comes in at number 5, which means that the Desolation of Smaug is number 4. For me, it feels like in this movie they get right into the action, which makes sense. It's the second in the trilogy, and you're kind of left with a bit of a cliffhanger. So you want to like pick up right where we left off in the action, which I like. You get more of the dwarves and the elves fighting the orcs, which makes me feel a little bit more at home. I like the barrel sequence. I think it's kind of one of the better action sequences in the entire trilogy. And I think really what it is like Bilbo and Smaug together is like really entertaining.
That's the compelling stuff. I mean, that is really the stuff that I remember it in the theater. I remember thinking it. I remember I had pretty positive things to say about the movie pretty much just for that one reason. And I would say that I echo the same sentiment. It's the coolest. It is really good. They do a great job. The CG on Smaug looks great. It
does look pretty good.
That's like probably the strongest CG in the trilogy, I would say. And then, I mean, the way it ends, the way that it's building and Thorne's getting crazier and crazier, because when he's full crazy at the beginning of Five Armies, there's moments that I like, but it's when he starts to compromise his decision making. That is when it gets that's the best. That's the meatiest stuff.
I think it is the best in Desolation of Smaug. Like when he's kind of waffling back and forth and making good and bad decisions and like casting people out and all that. I think he does a good job there. So now getting into our top 3. I mean, I wonder if anyone really is that surprised that the Hobbit trilogy comprised the bottom 3 and that the Lord of the Rings will be the top 3. I don't think so, though. No. So coming in our 3rd spot here, it's going to be
Best Picture winner, 13-time Oscar winner, The Return of the King. When we talked about this, when you walked in today, obviously we've spent the week watching these movies and talking about them. It's so hard to rank them now because I feel like the space between the 3 Lord of the Rings movies is very, very, very narrow.
Yeah.
Like I would put all 3 of them above a 9 out of 10. I don't really give many movies 9s. Like most movies don't get a 9 for me. I would put all 3 movies in the above 9 category. And so like I think Return of the King, in the end, it needs to be as long as it is because it has so much ground to cover, but it still does feel long when you watch it.
Yeah.
There's just some stuff... Shelob, there's just some stuff that doesn't totally 100% land for me. Like I find it to be a little bit more of a chore to watch than the first 2.
Definitely. Yeah, it really does feel like more of a chore. And then like going up into the mountains and like, working with the Ghost King or whatever. I have to admit, like I really don't like the end battle in Return of the King. I find it like pretty lackluster because like it feels like things are getting really, really bad, and then the ghosts come in and just kind of end everything.
Well, and all that stuff I said about Two Towers and how it's a huge battle, but it's smaller in its scope of what they film, so you can see what's happening.
Yeah.
The moments like when Eowyn slices out and she says, "I am no man," like that's a great moment because again, it's like you're focusing on one relationship in one spot on the battlefield.
Yes.
when you have a battle that really focuses on those things, I think it tends to be better than just like giant armies of CG.
For sure, because the beginning of that battle, I mean, you see Theoden die, like you're like so invested in it, and you know the Witch King is so evil. There's all this stuff, but then as it goes on and it gets grander, it feels like a little bit harder to attach to. I agree. I think it's too long.
It has like 5 endings too.
Yeah, it has. Like, it does. It really does. And like, even though this has nothing to do with the rankings, how the hell is Frodo going to leave Sam?
Yeah.
After all that, come on, Frodo.
Yeah, for sure.
Dick.
Right. He should have taken him to the afterlife.
Should have.
Yeah, he should have
like,
taken
even though you're the only reason I made it, you're going to die. I'm going to live forever.
He should have pulled rank, and he should have been like, look, either these hobbits all come with me, or I'm not going.
They're like, you're not going.
You're not going.
Shit. All right, so that means our number 2 and number 1 spots are all that's left, and this is going to be a bit of a different episode because we've done this before on an episode of Best and the Worst, but it felt wrong to not go with our personal preferences here for a tied number 1 spot.
Especially on something we love as much as this. It's contentious. I mean, like, it's hard because I think that if you're trying to evaluate the best of something, you want to feel like you have the same opinion. You're unified. You believe each other's arguments. But, like, I have now gone back to... I've probably watched every Lord of the Rings movie at least 8 or 9 times. At least. And I watched the extended versions a couple times, so I'm like intimately aware of how they make me feel. The way I always end up feeling when I watch them is that the Fellowship of the Ring is the most complete adventure. It feels, and I think it's probably because in some ways it opens the door for there's going to be more after this.
Yeah.
And like, this was amazing, but I'm just opening the door for this to get even bigger. That stuff's incredible. It has great confrontations and battles. I love... Obviously, Gandalf against the Balrog is amazing.
So sweet.
Meeting the Nazgul is incredible. Boromir is my favorite character. I love his death sequence is my single favorite sequence in all of Lord of the Rings.
So good.
It's so good. Like the horn, and then he's defending, and he takes the arrows, but he keeps fighting, and the look in his eyes, and then the thing at the
moment
end
with him and Aragorn.
Oh my god! And when Sam gets in the water, like Fellowship of the Ring for me is like, if I ever wanted to sell someone on like this sort of like fantasy sci-fi, go watch a Dungeons and Dragons style movie. This is the movie you show them.
Yeah.
This is 100% the movie you show them. It's just hard not to get into it. It's not even really a slow start.
It's really, it's really not. And I think what's interesting too about Fellowship and Two Towers is they're almost equal in my book, but they only change based off of my mood. Do I want to watch more badass, kick-ass, crazy shit? Then let's watch Two Towers. Do I want to watch a more contained, wonderful story that is being born with still some sweet action and great characters? I go Fellowship. The reason that I have Two Towers above right now, a couple of years ago, I think it was Fellowship. A couple of years before that, it was Two Towers. I think there's just things in the Two Towers that like I can't replicate in other movies. It's never like that feeling that I get when I watch Gandalf come down the hill with the sunlight right after Theoden sang his speech, right after Gimli blows the horn, like and like they've been battling for so long in Helm's Deep, and it seems like there's no way they're going to get out of it. I love that moment. I think the speech with Sam at the end of Two Towers is my favorite speech in the entire trilogy. I think it's the best too, because like I think Sam and Frodo, when they're completely on their own in Return of the King, I find it like a little bit less engaging than I do in Two Towers, when they're kind of like at the will of other people and trying to like prove their worth essentially. And then like I just love the fighting. I think it has the coolest action like period in the Two Towers. I absolutely love Helm's Deep.
It's a great fight. I mean, it is, and like that's the thing is, I think when you watch these movies back to back to back, it makes it even harder to pick.
Yeah,
they do feel in my mind, like when I think about different scenes, different moments, even though I've seen them all so many times, they do sort of feel like a cohesive memory. Like even it's hard for me to remember when I think about a scene that's slower or something I don't care as much about. Like it's hard to remember which movie it's in.
For sure.
I have a difficult time differentiating the memory because it's just so. Yeah, I mean, I think both are very strong picks. I'm curious then what you guys think. Yeah. I think especially in the top 3, there's a lot of variance in the ranking.
Yeah, I mean, most lists out there and rankings have Return of the King as the highest.
Yeah.
It won the most awards. It's got the highest score on IMDb. A lot of people have that up there. For me, Two Towers, I really love Theoden. I love meeting him. I love Wormtongue. PLD says that Return of the King is his favorite.
There you go.
And that's not a surprise, right? Like, I really do think that those first 3 are completely interchangeable. I could be convinced on any day. It just might be a little harder to convince me that Return of the King is the best just because of personal preference. But I, like you said, like if I had to score them, they're all above 9. They're all within like a point of each other. And yeah, it's just a bummer. It's a bummer that The Hobbit didn't really live up to it. but it's also how could you ever live up to the Lord of the Rings trilogy?
So what are you expecting from this show on Amazon? Like, how do you feel 20 years later now with 6 movies in the books and a series? Like, do you think we're gonna get 5 good seasons?
I'm like a pretty bad person to ask about stuff like this because I'm usually pretty skeptical.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's interesting because if you look at the trajectory of Star Wars, it's very similar, right? You have the original one that's so great. Then you had the prequels that came out and they were not awesome.
Yeah.
And then, we can skip the conversation about the most recent films, but then it moved into series, which people love Mandalorian. They love Boba Fett, right? So if the trajectory for Lord of the Rings is anything like that, great first trilogy, bad second trilogy, no other movies are coming out, but then they are going to go to series with this much money and this much, I guess, like commitment to excellence, it seems like, is going into this.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's going to be awesome. I just am not that excited, as weird as it is to say, because I love Lord of the Rings. I am just like, I just don't think it could possibly be as good as the first 3, and I don't want it to let me down like the Hobbit franchise did.
I think for me, anytime a very famous IP like this decides to go in the direction of television, my feeling and my objection is always the same. It's always like, yeah, but like then to know the whole story and to really feel like I'm like an expert on the subject, I have so much more content I'm going to feel like I have to watch, even if I don't really particularly like it. And I'm already experiencing that fatigue with Marvel a little bit. It already happened to me with Star Wars. I didn't watch Boba Fett.
Yep.
And I have not watched, still haven't watched the second season of Mandalorian. Now I think at some point
you liked Mandalorian.
It was great. It was really good. It was just something about like it didn't have the same iconic sort of like, this stands out. This is an important release. You get one of these every handful of years. It's 2.5 hours, and then you rank it and you think about it and you process it, and all the decisions were made. They know this character is going to get 17 total minutes of screen time, and they have to make the most of it because this is how much time they're going to get. It's different when it's like, next season we can give this character, 2.5 hours of screen time.
Or the audience is responding better to this person than this person. Let's give this person more,
It's speaking nothing to... I'm not trying to say anything negative about those things or the people that like them. I think it's just my optimism for a Lord of the Rings show is like, it's going to have to get like incredible reviews for me to watch it, because I will watch the pilot, obviously, and I will start watching it. But if it slows down at all, let's say I get through a whole season and I just wasn't that big of a fan, probably won't watch season 2.
It's really funny because like people used to refer to Game of Thrones as the R-rated version of Lord of the Rings on TV, and then now it feels like I've heard people referencing that Lord of the Rings is trying to do the Game of Thrones thing in series. It's just like this weird like dance that they're doing, going back and forth, and like I don't really understand that correlation. I think it's just because of like the set dressing and the situation. And like,
in the end, the Lord of the Rings, or in the end, Game of Thrones would be collectively assessed as really good for the first half, slowed down a little as it got towards the end, and a bad ending. Like that's like most people's general opinion of that show is that like, the last couple seasons suck. I didn't ever finish. Do you know this? I've still never watched the last 2 seasons.
I've never watched any of it.
And I loved Game of Thrones. Like I adored it. I just stopped watching it at the end. It took so long to come out and I just didn't care anymore.
Yeah, the fact that they already have 5 seasons planned feels like a lot.
Right.
Even if it's just 8 episodes, that's still 40 episodes to go. So I don't know. Anyway, guys, that's the best and the worst of Middle-earth. We had a tie, Fellowship and the Two Towers at our number 1 spot, Return of the King in the 3 spot, then Desolation of Smaug, An Unexpected Journey, and the Battle of the 5 Armies. That is our 1 through 6. Let us know what your thoughts are. Let us know how we did, whether it's in the comments or on Twitter. And that's going to do it for us for the best and the worst of Middle-earth. Next week, we will be back. Same time, same place for the best and the worst of disaster films.
Starting with a review of Moonfall. Roland Emmerich's new film. We're fighting the moon. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And a big shout out to all of the patrons who support us. These are our generals. Thanks for supporting the show.
These are our generals. Bye, guys. Call sign Kilmer, Quiz Show, Demon King, Public Enemy number 1, Kaiju, ACP, Robin, Kimura, Moses, Galactus, Bartab, Party J, The Gray, 24601. Call sign hashtag Ladies Night, JFTV, Wonderland, Quinn, Brosnan, Desperado, Jerry, The Slap, The Rock, Entrapment, Stamos, Dante's Peak, Top Gun, and Gundam. Big time salute to all of you guys.
Big time salute. Sign up on Patreon if you want to get your solo calls.
All right, guys, we'll see you next week on the best and the worst of M. Night Shyamalan. Take care.